Hello book lovers, and welcome back or welcome to Natcat's Bookish Cafe. Today I am here to go through my most disappointing reads of 2023. Alright guys, so 2023 is coming to an end. In fact, I think by the time you're seeing this video, it might have already ended because all of my end of year content is actually happening at the beginning of the year. But I am here to talk about 7 books that left me rather disappointed about certain aspects of the book. I will say that most of these are in no way my worst books. None of these are my worst books of 2023 list. In fact, 2 of them I gave 4.5 stars. But this is just books that every time I think about them, in flashing lights, I think of certain parts of the book that just left me very disappointed, and I'm just really excited to talk through these books. I'm in no way saying you shouldn't read them, but they just didn't give me what I was looking for. Before we get started, I just want to give you a heads up that these are not in any sort of particular order, so it's not least disappointing to most disappointing or most disappointing to least disappointing or anything like that. These are all just general disappointments. The first book on this list is going to be Authority by Jeff Vandermeer, and this is the sequel to Annihilation. Annihilation is a book that I read about a year ago and really enjoyed, and actually the movie adaptation is one of my favorite movies of all time. That being said, the movie and the book are rather different. This is a horror sci-fi story where we are following a group of women who are going into an area known as Area X. This area appeared one day many years ago and seems to be an area that is under a dome that once you pass through it, you can't really return. These women are known as the 12th expeditions, and previously none of the other expeditions have returned except for expedition number 11, but all of those men quickly died of cancer. As these women are exploring Area X, we start to see as the landscape starts to change them. It is very much a psychological horror, and I really enjoyed the creativity of Area X and just the nature horror aspect of it. Authority takes place after the events of Annihilation. We are following someone who is working at the science facility that is set right outside of Area X. And he is going in there to kind of restructure this facility because it just hasn't been very productive in the last few years. However, as he arrives there, he feels a lot of pushback from the people that are working there because their previous director has gone missing into Area X, and they're all kind of waiting for her return. While this book still had Jeff Vandermeer's wonderful creative writing in it and definitely still had some of those psychological horror aspects to it, it very much was a bridge book. I felt like everything that happened in this book was just to get us from point A to point B. In other words, from book 1 to book 3. And so at the end of the day, I really just felt like this book was way longer than it needed to be, and that it just had too much filler in it. The next book on this list is one of those books that I gave 4.5 stars, and that is Painted Devils by Margaret Owen. This is once again a sequel. This is the sequel to Little Thieves, and this is a story that follows Vanya, and she is a girl who had in the first book stolen the life of a princess and was using that princess's face to help her steal jewels from the wealthy. One day when she had stolen from the wrong family that was under the protection of a god, she is cursed to slowly turn into jewels unless she returns everything she has stolen, every penny, as well as the life of the princess. As she goes on this journey to return what she has stolen, she is accompanied by a group of unlikely friends. I really enjoyed the first story and was super excited to get into the second book. And I will say in the second book, for about 90% of it, I was having a great time. And it probably could have been a 5-star read if it weren't for the ending. The problem is that I was under the assumption that this was a duology. And I feel like when going into this series, the author may have been under the same assumption as well. However, when those final couple chapters happened, it became obvious that they were going to squeeze a third book out. And the way that the author did this was kind of by repeating what happened at the end of book 1, which in my opinion undoes everything that happened in book 2, making book 2 irrelevant. And it was so frustrating because I felt like so many wonderful things happened, so much character growth, so much relationship development happened in that story. We learned so much about Vanya's past, about the family that she's been searching for. We watched her relationship with the young boy that she met in the first book develop as well, and then that was all null and void by the end of this story, and it just didn't make any sense to me why the author would do this. I'm assuming all of this will come together again in book 3, but this really could have been a duology. Despite me loving the characters and loving the world and being more than happy to read a third book, I really think that the way that she kind of transitioned into this being a trilogy was a bit sloppy. So unfortunately, that left me very disappointed, and every time I think about this series, I get a little bit grouchy that she did that. The next book on here is another sequel. It seems like I had problems with sequels this year, and that is The Mime Order by Samantha Shannon. The first book in this series is called The Bone Seasons, or The Bone Season. And in this book, we are following Paige, and she is a clairvoyant in a world where it is illegal to be a clairvoyant. She's a very unique clairvoyant in that her soul can leave her body, and she is actually learning to see if she can take over other people's bodies in her spirit form. She is a part of a guild called the Seven Seals, and they are part of an underground network of clairvoyants. She actually has a very high position in this guild as his Molisher, which I think is the name of what she is, which pretty much means she is a second in command to her leader. However, one day she gets on a train and there are some officers there who sense that she is a clairvoyant and arrest her. And then the series kind of continues from there as she starts to discover another secret world that she never even knew about. I ended up giving the first book 4.5 stars. I had a really great time with that story. I am excited to hear that Samantha Shannon is rewriting the books because there was definitely some need for improvement, but all in all, I had a wonderful time with Paige and exploring this new world that she was exploring, as well as meeting all of these new characters. Book 2, it's very hard to talk about without being spoilery, but I felt that book 2 was just like Authority, a bridge book. I felt like the author was taking a lot of opportunity to do a lot of world building throughout the story, and so there wasn't too much plot development. I felt like we were just kind of following our character around as she learned stuff, and overall I just felt like we did not have to dedicate this 400 or so page book to that kind of world building, that it could have just been included in the story in a more natural way. It left me incredibly bored throughout this entire story. I will say the series did go downhill for me. I read book 3 as well and was left unimpressed once again. I felt like I was really struggling to connect with Paige, our main character, outside of the first book. I just felt like she was in over her head and was continuing to make foolish decisions, and that no one more experienced or older at the very least was stepping in to help guide her on this very treacherous journey. I still need to read book 4 before I decide if I'm going to DNF this series or not, just because I do own it. But for now, I will say that outside of book 1, the series is very underwhelming, but maybe once she rewrites it, she will fix her mistakes. Up next, we have Sanctuary with Kings by Catherine Moon, and this is a book that completes the Tempting Monsters series, the first of which is A Lady of Rooksgrave Manor. I have had such a fun time with this series, including the novella A Basilisk of Star Manor, which I'm usually not much of a novella girly, especially when it comes to romance, but Catherine Moon has just been doing it for me. The series is a reverse harem monster romance series, and in each book we have been following a different girl as she gathers her monstrous lovers around her. There's also an underlying theme of a dangerous man who is looking to control monsters and is also using them, and I believe possibly consuming parts of them, to be immortal. And he owns multiple brothels in which most of the people working there are not there willingly. And here in this final book, we follow one of those women who was working in these brothels, and she was in there for hundreds of years. Obviously, unfortunately, being sexually assaulted on multiple occasions. She herself is a type of, I want to say she's the daughter of a goddess of sorts, where she feeds off of pleasure, but it needs to be a certain type of pleasure. So this forced pleasure that she has been nibbling on for the last 100 years has left her very emaciated and starved. She is taken in by a couple of monsters to a faraway castle to recover, in hopes that she will join the final battle against this villain. My main problem with this book is, unlike in all the other books of the series, I didn't love the love interests. Usually, while I didn't love all of them equally, there were at least a few of them that I absolutely adored. And unfortunately in this book, I felt somewhat indifferent towards the majority of them. And I also felt like this book was too long. I know that was a complaint about some of the other books. I didn't notice that in the first couple, but in this one, the pacing was incredibly slow for my taste. I really tried to be understanding. We are dealing with a love interest who has experienced a lot of sexual trauma, so there's no way that she's just gonna start jumping on her men and riding them or anything like that. But I do think that the story was just a little slow for a reverse horror monster romance, especially because with those romances, you don't have to develop a relationship just between two people. You have to develop a relationship between like 4 or 5 people, and that takes time. And so in the end, I just felt like everything was overly rushed. I will say that I did enjoy the final battle, so I'm glad I didn't DNF it, but I will say I was kind of close a few times. Up next, we have The Vanishing Birds by Simon Jimenez, and this is a sci-fi story. I have seen more people talking about it recently. I personally heard about it from Jess on YouTube, and they highly recommended it, so I went ahead and checked it out. This is a sci-fi story where we are following a woman who transports material products across the universe, and because she has to time jump, she doesn't really have like a home or anything, because she will travel for a week to one location, and by the time she gets back to her home base, maybe 10, 20, 50 years have passed since she has left, but she has only aged a week. One day she shows up at a planet to pick up their harvest, and they present to her a boy who fell from the sky. This boy seems to be mute, but she goes ahead and takes him back to her home base, which also happens to be the central planet of the overruling empire in the universe. Throughout this story, we also get flashbacks to the creator of this empire, and we just follow her during her journey as a scientist to create the ability for humans to live and travel in space. I would say that the story definitely has a heavy theme of colonization on it, since this empire is going into planets and is destroying a lot of their resources and kind of forcing them to focus on producing one product for them, which obviously we want diversity in ecosystems and in their ability to provide their own products to stimulate their own economy, which they can't do when this big power is coming in and saying you can only make these berries or whatnot. So I will say that the story has a very interesting concept to it. My problem was that I was promised a found family aspect, and I don't know where I got that idea. Maybe I misinterpreted it, but I would say that the found family aspect of the story was very weak to me. I felt like our main character and this boy's relationship was just not as strong as I wanted it to be. I mean, the decisions and the actions they were taking definitely proved that they cared very much about each other, but at the same time, I personally could just never feel that emotion like I felt like I was supposed to. So I personally was just a bit disappointed in my disinterest in the characters and their relationships. I would say that if you are here for the plots or the kind of commentary on colonization, then you will probably enjoy it. I think that was done very well in this story. But as far as found family goes, it just didn't hit the mark for me. Moving on to our second to last book, we have Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black. And this is a story in which a Black father is dying, and he is writing letters to his queer son who he is estranged from. He talks a lot about his past, and what I'm assuming is an attempt to explain why he treated his son in certain ways. I picked up this book because I was hoping it would give me what Razor Blade Tears never gave me, which was a father and a son sitting down and having these conversations. Obviously, in Razor Blade Tears, that couldn't be done because the sons were dead, but in this book, his son is still alive. However, that is not what happens in the story. It really is just a history of this man, and from that you're kind of supposed to realize how this toxic masculinity as well as racism had led him to be so opposed to his son being queer. I definitely think that this story is an important story and definitely has its place on people's bookshelves, but it once again, just like Razor Blade Tears, did not give me that father-son relationship that I was hoping for. In fact, I feel like he spent very little time on his son at all. It was very much just him talking about himself, kind of what made him the man that he is, and his slow realization of his flaws. A very good book, a very emotional book, but if you're looking for a man to sit down with his son or even to see his son's reaction to his father's changes, you're not going to get that in this book, and that was a bummer for me for sure. I also felt like this book does not really offer any sort of closure, which I was hoping to get as well. So I would definitely recommend checking out this book, but just to keep in mind or to temper your expectations for what you'll get. All right, guys, and we are on to the final book, and this is the second 4.5-star rating on this list, and that is The Sword of Kon by M.L. Wang. Now, this book is incredible and you should 100% read it despite it being a chonker. In this book, we are following the Masuda family, and they are a very powerful family in the kingdom of Kaigon, or Empire of Kaigon. And they have the ability to wield the element of water and ice, if I remember correctly. At the beginning of this book, the family starts to realize that war is on the horizon and that an enemy that they had destroyed many generations ago is making its way to their border once again. Our two main characters are 14-year-old Mamoru and his mother Misaki. This book is incredibly heartbreaking. It does not shy away from how quick and destructive war can be. This is not a long drawn out battle by any stretch of the imagination. It's there, it's over, and it leaves a lot of dead bodies in its wake. We kind of watch this young boy as he kind of needs to transition from preparing for the possibility of war, just kind of starting to learn the concept of war, to being in the middle of a war and on the front lines of it. We are then also following Misaki. We get a little bit of her past as she learned to be a sword fighter, but nowadays she's just a mother and just a wife. But as war threatens her household, her family, her children, she will pick up that sword again. This is a story that is drenched in sorrow, but it focuses very heavily on community and family as well. Loved 99% of what happened in this book. Made me cry my eyes out. The problem, and it's not that I'm disappointed in this book, it's more that I'm disappointed in the marketing, and I keep trying to tell people this is not a standalone. This is marketed as a fantasy standalone, and you can definitely read it on its own, but you will be left with questions. I would say that this is very much a prequel, and I'm sure in a lot of cases you can usually read a prequel on its own and you can decide not to continue with the story, but there will be open-ended plot points when you finish the story. For me, I felt like in the last few chapters of this book, the author was introducing a lot of information that would be relevant in the other series that he wrote. And if you read just this book, you will be left wondering, what was that? Why did that happen? What is happening with that? And what does it mean? So I just want people to be aware that if you read this as a standalone, you are going to finish this book with questions. You're gonna be like, who is this new villain on the horizon? Who is this new character that's obviously gonna be the main character of this other series? When I looked up this other series, I think it's a YA story and that it may have been discontinued, which was a bit of a bummer, which is why also I never decided to pick it up. But I just find it so disappointing that the author had this super strong standalone story and then just introduced this character and all these plot points and this new threat and never did anything with it unless you went into that other series. I think it would have been totally okay if he had just not included that aspect of the story, and then if you looked at the other series, you would have just been like, oh, I recognize that name. That is a character from so-and-so's past. How interesting that the story is connected that way. That would have been totally fine, but he very much did an introduction for that other series in this book, which in my mind makes this not a standalone, and also left me unsatisfied with this as a standalone. So overall, still 10 out of 10, I recommend this story. Just know that when you finish the story is very much not finished. All right, guys, those are my most disappointing reads of the year. Luckily, none of them were too terrible. You'll have to wait until my worst books of the year to see which books I thought were terrible. I would love to know if you read any disappointing books this year, any anticipated releases that ended up falling flat for you, or any 5-star predictions that ended up just being a 3-star or even worse, like a 2-star. As always, thank you so much for supporting my channel by watching my videos, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!